Today is July 20th, 2025. The conflict in Ukraine continues to grind on. This is taking place at a moment when earlier Trump campaign promises and then early administration promises have gradually given way to what is now just openly continuity of agenda. The United States is continuing Biden-era wars in the Middle East. It is continuing to expand its military presence in the Asia-Pacific region vis-a-vis China. And of course, the war that President Donald Trump promised to end in 24 hours now continues unabated. In many ways, it continues to escalate. I'm going to talk about all of that today. The first thing I want to do is go to the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It's a pro-Ukrainian map. Just keep that in mind when you look at this. This is a map that is going to try to delay depicting Russian gains for as long as possible. It will emphasize or even exaggerate Ukrainian gains. And even still, looking at this pro-Ukrainian map, you can see the dire straits Ukraine and its Western backers are in. However, as I'm going to get into later on in this video, the point of this war was not to defeat Russia in Ukraine. If that was a possibility, of course, the US and its European proxies, its client states in Europe and elsewhere, would attempt to do that. But the primary purpose of this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is to entangle Russia in a costly, protracted conflict. And that is exactly what has happened, is to raise the cost for Russia and to keep its resources tied up in Ukraine so that Russia cannot respond elsewhere, like, say, in Syria, or in regards to Iran, or in any way shore up Russian strength either internally or elsewhere along its periphery, where the West, the United States and the rest of the West, is applying pressure. And of course, in terms of the US encirclement and containment of China, Russia will have fewer resources to aid in that as well. And the US is doing this to Russia's allies, Iran, and also China, to likewise tie them up in local conflicts along their periphery, preventing them from mobilizing their resources to help their Russian allies or Iranian allies. Let's zoom in along the line of contact, which goes from Kherson across Zaporozhye into the Donbass region, and of course here, Kharkov, and now the Sumy region. I have not done a video like this and gone to the map in a while. Let's look at Pokrovsk, because this is what everyone is talking about this week in the Western media, and I will show you some examples of that. This is the city of Pokrovsk, and as you can see, the Russians have encircled it. And I explained months and months ago that as Russian forces approached Pokrovsk, as a matter of fact, there is a timeline here, and we're going to go back to January 1st, 2025. This is where Russian forces were. And I remember at the time the Western media saying that Ukrainian forces have slowed the Russian advance. And I said at the time, that is not how any of this works. It's not how any of these battles for these cities have ever worked. Russian forces arrive at the city, then they begin encircling it. They do not just steamroll over the city. That doesn't make any sense in terms of modern warfare. They have to encircle the city. They have to cut off the defenders logistically, and they have to wear down their positions, grind them down before finally overtaking the city. And that is what has happened from January until now, as you can see on the map. If we go back, you will see the extent to which Pokrovsk is now encircled. And of course, you have to remember there are drones and missiles and artillery working all of these logistical routes, bringing in extra soldiers, equipment, food, water, ammunition, everything else the defenders inside Pokrovsk itself require. And you can see right on the outskirts of the urban area that there are Russian forces. And again, this is a pro-Ukrainian map. And then, of course, we look elsewhere along the line of contact. We can see ultimately Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. This is the ultimate objective for Russian forces in the Donbass region, to eventually take these. And so you can see they're working their way up along this main route that leads into Kramatorsk and Salvyansk from the south and from the north. And this is going towards Izium, where Russian forces had, in the very beginning, in 2022, they had held Izium. They had since been pushed back during the 2022 Ukrainian offensive. And of course, Russian forces continue putting pressure absolutely everywhere else. And once Ukrainian forces were thrown out of Kursk, right here, Sudzha was the main concentration of Ukrainian forces. They are now completely gone. This pro-Ukrainian map isn't even pretending there's a Ukrainian foothold here anymore. Russian forces established what they're calling a buffer zone in Ukrainian territory in Sumy, where they had not previously been since they were pushed out in, again, the 2022 Ukrainian offensive. And so this is what is happening along the line of contact. Of course, every single day and night, Russia is bombarding targets all across Ukraine with cruise missiles, with drones of every kind, ballistic missiles like the Iskander, glide bombs, of course, continue to be used all along the line of contact and beyond it. And this is having an accumulative effect. Myself, others who have been following the conflict closely all along, including Alex and Alexander of the Duran, Mark Sloboda, Scott of Calibrated, we have all been talking about the gradual reduction of stockpiles of Western air defense systems and munitions. They are being worn down, and the ability of the West collectively to continuously resupply Ukraine is just dwarfed by the huge amount of drones and missiles Russia is firing at Ukraine. And now we are hearing this story. I want to talk about this because something is going on that they are not being honest about. This is from the Kyiv Independent, again, a very pro-Ukrainian source, pro-Western. Germany to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles very soon, Merz says. And this is not some idea that Chancellor Friedrich Merz just came up with on his own. This would have been in development for months, if not a year or more. They're talking about new long-range missiles that will be supplied to Ukraine, but they're also claiming that they are, because here is another related article. Germany funded long-range weapons to arrive in Ukraine by late July, and yet they continuously refer to them as domestically produced. In other words, Ukrainian-made weapons arriving in Ukraine. How does that work? What are they talking about? And what they're almost certainly talking about are German missiles, or at least parts of German missiles, at best, being assembled at facilities in Ukraine, if even, and then used by Ukraine. And this is just an elaborate workaround from Germany building the missiles and just openly supplying them to Ukraine. And this could be the Taurus air-launched cruise missile. It could be some other type of missile. There were plans being circulated amongst NATO member states and, of course, the US itself, since this conflict began, a way to launder long-range missiles to Ukraine by claiming that they're being produced by Ukraine itself, so that the West can absolve itself from responsibility of these missiles when they are used against targets inside Russia. If the collective West, with existing missile factories, cannot expand production over the course of the last 3 going on to 4 years, how are they building a whole new facility or even upgrading a facility in Ukraine to produce what Germany claims will be triple-digit quantities of these long-range missiles? It's impossible. It's impossible. This is a cover for just the transfer of German missiles to Ukraine, almost certainly. And at most, they will be entirely manufactured by Germany and then maybe just, connected and a few bolts put in once they arrive in Ukraine, just so that they're technically made in Ukraine. So there's that. There was also this. This is from The Guardian. These are updates. Starmer confirmed. So we're talking about the Prime Minister of The UK confirms Western peacekeeping force in Ukraine includes land elements. Now, I have been talking about this since February of this year. I warned that this was going to happen. Asked specifically about the presence on the ground, he confirms that the peacekeeping force proposed by the so-called Coalition of the Willing, designed by military planners from participating countries, includes plans for the air, for the sea, and yes, for land. So they're talking about securing the airspace over Ukraine. They're talking about the Black Sea, NATO presence in the Black Sea, and NATO troops inside of Ukraine. How is that? Why does that sound familiar? And why was I talking about this since February? Because U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, all the way back in February 12th, 2025 to be precise, and this is on the official Department of Defense website, opening remarks by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at Ukraine Defense Contact Group. This was in Brussels, and this was when the real plan of the Trump administration for Ukraine was unveiled. And it wasn't to end the conflict and achieve any sort of peace. It was to freeze the conflict, create a Syria-style buffer zone on the ground so that the US could pivot toward Iran and ultimately China, because they are incapable of fighting Russia, Iran, and China all at the same time. So this is strategic sequencing and a division of labor being applied here. And Secretary Hegseth literally uses the term division of labor. Here, Secretary Hegseth talks about how the US needs to pivot toward China in the Pacific. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. He's outsourcing US hegemony to Europe in regards to Ukraine. And he's talking about spending not 2%, but 5% of each NATO member state's GDP on defense. He talked about double down and recommit not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals in regards to Russia. So this was never about making peace with Russia. He was telling you up front in February, there was no intention to make peace with Russia. They're losing this proxy war. They need to freeze it at a minimum. A ceasefire would achieve this. The ceasefire would allow them to move these troops into Ukraine and freeze the conflict so that they could direct resources elsewhere. And then once they are done dismembering the Iranian nation state and in their minds effectively encircling and containing China, they can circle back and deal with Russia later. That is the whole plan. This is not just something Secretary Hegseth said back in February. This is based on many policy papers that I have gone over the years, over and over again. Policy papers connected to President Trump's administration itself, the America First Policy Institute, the Marathon Initiative, and also Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. They all laid out this very same policy. That was what they were going to do before President Trump even ran for office in 2024. All of this talk about ending the conflict, making peace with Russia, ending the forever wars. This was just for public consumption. This is what all politicians do. They tell you what you want to hear to get your support. And then once they have your support and they're in office, they do the exact opposite. This is what President Barack Obama did while campaigning. And then once he got into office, he took every war that he inherited from the previous Bush administration, he expanded all of them, and he started additional wars. This is what President Trump did during his first term, and to nobody's surprise, or it should be to no one's surprise, he is now doing it again in his second term. Let's talk about this ground force that we hear the UK talking about. Secretary Hegseth, back in February 2025, a durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be a Minsk 3, but what he's describing is literally just Minsk 3.0. They don't want NATO membership for Ukraine, because if Ukraine had NATO membership, then the US would be stuck once again. The conflict would be unfrozen because the US would have to come to Ukraine's aid. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. So that was Secretary Hegseth back in February. And then this is British Prime Minister Keir Starmer confirming that this is all being prepared right now. And I warned people that this was going to happen and that Europe would pretend to be opposed to President Trump in the beginning, but eventually they would come around and obediently fulfill all of these directives delivered by Secretary Hegseth. So European and non-European troops, if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission. And they should not be covered under Article 5 because the US does not want to rush to their rescue if Russia begins fighting with these European and non-European troops when they enter into Ukraine. And so what is this? This is a Syria-style buffer zone. This is to freeze the conflict until a time at a later date the US is in a better position to push back and finally fully overextend, possibly either push the Russians out or undermine and collapse Russia itself. That is the grand plan. And we know that because it's been stated US policy for years. I remember pointing out this Rand Corporation paper from 2019, Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. There's a table of contents here with all kinds of geopolitical measures: provide lethal aid to Ukraine, increase support to the Syrian rebels, promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia, challenge Russian presence in Moldova. And every single one of these measures, in one way or another, have been put into practice by multiple US presidential administrations, from Trump's first, from Barack Obama's administration to President Trump's first administration, all throughout the Biden administration, and now it continues under this second Trump administration. And of course, this measure, provide lethal aid to Ukraine, they talk about the benefits, and this is what they say: expanding US assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the cost to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So this was always about extending Russia, overextending Russia, tying Russia down, not necessarily defeating Russia in Ukraine. So it's very important to keep all of that in mind. And it's important to keep in mind the role each administration played, from the Obama administration all the way up to the current Trump administration, how each administration is responsible for advancing a different part of this same agenda. It's called continuity of agenda. Is very important to keep in mind. What else are they talking about recently in regards to the war in Ukraine? Another article from the Kyiv Independent from July 20th, 2025. Russia aims to launch 2,000 drones towards Ukraine at once, German general says. And we're looking at just Garan 2 drones alone being sent in waves of several hundred per day. We're hearing talk of 1,000 or more, and now they're saying 2,000 drones at one time. And we're talking about Garan drones, we're talking about FPV drones, we're talking about the overabundance of drones Russia has at its disposal that it is using. And this goes along with everything else as part of its military-industrial buildup. Not just drones, but missiles of all kinds: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, armored vehicles, artillery shells, artillery pieces, artillery counter-battery radar. Absolutely everything is being churned out by state-owned enterprises in Russia in quantities the collective West simply cannot match. I've been talking about this for years now, and now we can see the collective West saying this openly, when a year or two ago you would be called a Russian propagandist for saying these things. Now they are admitting it. And down here, I think it's interesting. Last hour for Pokrovsk. So interesting how bleak the outlook is across the collective West in regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Gone is the at least even the illusion of optimism in regards to this conflict. And then I noticed several articles this week, actually the last day or so, about Ukraine itself calling for talks with Russia for next week. And you have to ask yourself, why? What is the purpose of all of this? We watched President Trump pretend that he wanted peace in Ukraine, and the first step was getting Russia to agree to a ceasefire that would have immediately have been used to freeze the conflict, not actually end it. They would have poured NATO and non-NATO troops into Ukraine, as is the plan, openly is the plan. And they would have froze the conflict, and this would have been a festering national security threat for Russia indefinitely until it was eventually settled. And the only way it's going to be settled is if Russia settles it itself militarily on the ground, just as was the case with Syria. There was never going to be a political settlement. It had to be settled on the ground. And in that case, it was settled in favor of the United States. Russia needs to see this through. I think that is their intention. And that is why they, not that they're not interested in peace, but US proposals, Ukrainian proposals are not honest attempts at peace. They are simply trying to freeze the conflict. It is Minsk 3.0, as Secretary Hegseth claimed it wasn't, but it obviously is. Now, I want to talk about the M1 Abrams US-made main battle tank. This is from the National Interest. I saw other analysts talking about this, Alexander Mikiris of the Duran, Mark Sloboda, and others. Russia has decimated Ukraine's M1 Abrams fleet, and this is as of July 13th, 2025. I said this was going to happen before the first Abrams rolled onto the battlefield. I said the same thing would happen with the Leopard 2s and also the Challenger 2s, and as predicted, that is exactly what has happened. But then it's curious to see Australia talking about sending additional Abrams. To what end? There's no purpose of sending these. They're almost certainly going to be destroyed. They're talking about sending 49 tanks, and they will be arriving after 9 months. So sometime this year, they will be getting these tanks, and then they will be subsequently destroyed one by one on the battlefield. Wherever they pop up, Russia will destroy them. And I have heard people talking about Australia sending these tanks to this conflict in Ukraine and how this might be a distraction away from US goals in regard to China. Australia is in the Indo-Pacific region the US is focused on. And shouldn't they be preserving their weapons for a potential war with China, a war the US is trying to provoke with China? And the answer is M1 Abrams will not be used in this upcoming conflict. Things like tanks, artillery shells, other types of armored vehicles, these will not be used. It'll be air power and naval power. And we have actually watched the United States itself, Europe collectively, and nations like Australia, even South Korea to a certain extent, dividing their weaponry into systems they can spare for Ukraine and things they must keep on hand for the war the US wants to fight with China, and wants to fight with China using these proxies in the Asia-Pacific region. So Australia is keeping on hand the weapons they will need for that war in the Pacific. M1 Abrams tanks will be completely useless. Send them to Ukraine to continue extending Russia. The point isn't to change the situation on the battlefield. It's just to keep the war going a little bit longer. And finally, just to circle back around to the RAND Corporation's extending Russia policy paper, I think it's important we talked about the benefits US policymakers saw in provoking this war with Russia in Ukraine. What about the risks? Here it talks about Such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to US prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, which we now see taking place, territorial losses that has happened irreversibly, it would seem, and refugee flows by the millions. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is exactly where we are. So that paper, published in 2019, saw this war in Ukraine as an opportunity to overextend Russia, or at least tie it down, while the US performed strategic sequencing amid its division of labor. They knew that the almost certain outcome of the conflict would be Ukraine's destruction, and they went ahead with it anyway. And they're going to do the same thing in regards to war with Iran in the Middle East, and the very same thing in the Asia-Pacific region vis-a-vis China. So we have to keep a close eye on all of this. We have to look at how all of these conflicts work together, because it is one single global policy the US is pursuing. Global hegemony over the entire planet. They're attempting to encircle and contain and eliminate any peer or near peer adversaries. That includes Russia, that includes Iran, and also China. They also will not tolerate so-called allies having any sort of independent foreign policy. They have politically captured these nations. These are client states of the US, and they exercise power over them, and they exercise policy through them, as is the case with Ukraine, as is the case with many proxies around the globe as part of this overarching strategy. We have to understand that the US isn't necessarily trying to defeat Russia in Ukraine. Overall, there is a policy of encirclement, containment, division, destruction of Russia. Tying Russia down in Ukraine is just one part of a much larger strategy, not just regarding Russia itself, but regarding all of these other peer and near-peer adversaries the US is trying to take down to maintain its unipolar world order versus this emerging multipolar world. We have to understand that that's where the lines are when we're trying to understand developments as they take place, day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I post my videos on YouTube, Telegram, X, and Rumble. In the video description below will be all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them or block them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Again, the links will be in the video description below. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping by sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.